Day 72 of the U.S. war on Iran. A tense, fragile ceasefire holds over the Strait of Hormuz after a new round of naval clashes that saw U.S. forces disable two Iranian tankers in the last 24 hours. Tehran condemns the strikes as a flagrant violation of the truce. President Donald Trump stands at the White House saying he expects an Iranian reply to his final proposal within hours. And behind the scenes, Pakistan's diplomacy is racing to buy time. In the last 48 hours, not a single major insured commercial vessel has transited the strait. Brent crude is hovering near $100 a barrel. U.S. gasoline prices are 50% higher than before the war. European industry is bleeding. And the transatlantic alliance, the bedrock of Western security since 1949, is showing cracks that no summit can easily seal. But the deeper question is not just when the next ceasefire will be signed, it is whether this war is being fought for American interests or for an agenda drafted far from Washington, and whether the rules-based international order can survive a conflict in which one side gets to blockade, bomb, and sanction with impunity while lecturing the world on law. We will examine all of this tonight on All 24 News Special with our panel shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to All 24 News special coverage. And to break down the geopolitical, economic, and legal dimensions of this crisis, we're joined tonight by four experts. Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Associate Dean and Professor of International Studies at California State University from Los Angeles, a leading eye on U.S. foreign policy and its domestic drivers. Hello there, Professor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us tonight.
Thank you, Kareem, for honoring me.
No, the honor is all ours, Professor. Trust me. And Dr. Irfan Raja joins us from London. He's a political analyst and media specialist, an observer of the human cost of the war amid the propaganda and narrative battles that accompany it. Hello there, Dr. Irfan Raja, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much once again, and I appreciate your description of myself. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. And also we're joined by Professor Daniela Herrera, who is a professor of international relations at the Advanced Defense Studies School, CASD, from Rome, specialist in international law, civil society, and European security architecture, who is going to focus on the political narrative here. Hello there, Professor, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for having me tonight.
The pleasure is ours, Professor. And also we have Mr. Mark William Lowe. He's a corporate and geopolitical risk management expert to join us from Genoa, Italy, a specialist in how geopolitical shocks cascade through energy markets and corporate balance sheets. Hello there, Mr. William Mark Lowe, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. Always a pleasure, Kareem.
The pleasure is ours, Mr. Mark Lowe. All right, let's start with you, Dr. Hamoud Salhi. Let's speak a little bit about this war and who really authorized it. Dr. Salhi, Congressman Thomas Macy has actually demanded a recorded vote on the war, saying you cannot bomb a regime into freedom. Bipartisan voices from Elizabeth Warren to Josh Hawley are questioning the lack of an exit strategy, yet the war continues to grind on. Critiques like Scott Ritter argue that the so-called Israel lobby, embodied by think tanks such as the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the Hudson Institute, has manufactured the consensus for this conflict. As a scholar of U.S. policy, is there, as some analysts insist, a rare and growing acceptance within the American establishment that this is a lost war being waged for the Tel Aviv's benefit, not Washington's? And why has Congress all but surrendered its war powers?
There's a lot of there, Karim. At the start, it is very clear that the consensus that existed before, or you could say appearing to exist, where the idea that this war, which started from the beginning as not supported by majority of the population, that consensus is disappearing. But if we look at specifically at Mathis and Warren, Mathis is a part of the Republican, moderate, and liberal who constitute a third of the Republican Party. He has 71% of the support of the Republican in the recent polls because of his anti-position to Israel and anti-position to the war in Iraq. Against Israel and Iran. The war itself, when it started from the idea that this was not a good idea to go to it. There were only 38% of people who supported it. That number now is at 25%. So from the start, it wasn't that favorable. If we go back to the Republicans, among the young adults Republican, the shift has been seismic. It went from 47% not supporting the war to only 33% of those supporting the war. This is a very, very important group because this is the group that helped take Trump to power. So both on the war and on the Republicans' side, and we could go through the Democrats, it's the same trend, and it's more than that. There is a huge consensus among the majority of the population that this war is not doing good to the American society. The reason these actions continue, or the war continues, is that public opinion, on the one hand, tend to take longer time to translate into actions. The actions that we have seen so far as opposing the war are really sporadic and they come on rare moments. There are, to admit, there are demonstrations before consulates, in some parts of the world. There are demonstrations almost on a weekly basis against Israel in front of the Israelis' embassies and in several areas of the country. And so that there is that issue. On the War Power Resolution Act, that also explain or help us explain why this war continues. Congress has been ineffective, and this is a trend not new. But when it comes to War Power Resolution, when the 60 days expired, Donald Trump and his team were able to maneuver through a legality or a legal loophole by arguing, number one, that the war ended when we started the ceasefire, then it ended before the 60 days. And then they launched the Operation Freedom. And that was against in response to some who advised that they can continue, Donald Trump, the American or the White House or whoever, this war can continue if you have another operation in place. So that sort of helped creating those conditions. Mm-hmm. What we've seen now on the ground is that and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. If this translates into a war and a major attack, that will give President Donald Trump another 60 days or a reason to argue that the war, that he's forced to do the war. The whole Iran war put the Congress into a very, very difficult position because on the one hand, they don't support, especially those who don't support it, and a large number of them, the public is against it. But they could not go and vote against Donald Trump, meaning that bringing the American troops to the country, and that would be perceived by the public as detrimental to American national interests, which of course President Donald Trump will make sure that will be the message propagated.
Excellent, excellent. Now, let me bring in Dr. Raja Irfan. Dr. Raja, for years, the United States has vetoed multiple UN Security Council resolutions relating to the Zionist entity's conduct, shielding its ally from international legal scrutiny. Now, Washington rushes to the very same council to condemn Iran and justify a blockade. As a media expert, how do you see the publics across the Middle East, the global South, reading this? Is this war perhaps killing not only people, but also the very credibility of the rules-based order, confirming what many already believe, that the international law is a weapon applied to the enemies of the powerful and a shield for their friends?
You are exactly right, and I think you have already summed up part of my question answer. I think very recently, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he came up and he talked, and I quote him. He said, "What is the purpose of UN?" So he was asking the world, "What is the purpose of UN?" And then he was telling the UN was supposed to be a place where you can peacefully resolve global conflicts, and then he went on, and then he said that you have a country, and he was obviously talking about Iran, who is unlawfully, criminally, and illegally taking possession of international waters. And then how outrageous it is, and then they asked the whole world to come and stand with America. Actually, if you look at the ongoing genocide in Gaza, his remarks are very much fitted and related to Gaza, not to Iran, actually. This all suggests to me what a great British writer, George Orwell, said decades ago. His phrase, doublespeak. And an American professor, Edward Herman, wrote a very famous book about this. He was a media analyst and economist. He's an expert figure, and he said that there are the Western, particularly the U.S. foreign policy, and its media construct is a dichotomy of good and bad. If the terrorists are sponsored by the state, they are good terrorists. If they are people who are fighting for their freedom, which are freedom fighters, but then the state, including America, they would rush and frame them as bad terrorists. We have President Trump. It is on record. He said famously that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, they were behind creating ISIS. So look, in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, and elsewhere, Americans have created groups in Afghanistan, good Taliban, and these days they are bad Talibans, because once they fight for them, they were fighting against the USSR. When the mission is accomplished, and suddenly the friends become foe, and the Americans media started portraying them as bad guys. Same applies over and over again. We have bad terrorists and we have good terrorists. Until and unless the whole world, especially the Americans and the Western, they must understand that people are no naive now. We are living in the age of new media. The world is moved on. So they must have to stop these double standards. Even this phrase is very old, outdated, and it has lost its currency. It is contested term now because there are so many standards. So you are very right. In the global, not only in global South, elsewhere, here in Europe as well, the young generation particularly, and the other classes, there is a resentment, and that you have seen just yesterday. What happened in the US, in the UK, because in the general elections, the sitting prime minister, their party is no more, they lost. And similarly, very briefly, it is going to happen in America in the upcoming midterm elections, because I don't think so. If such double standards and things continue, people are really, the ordinary people are suffering. They are the victims of this war. Cost of rising prices. I did tell you last time. It was a prediction which became true yesterday night. So I would end with this. That there are it's everything is on record, and yes, the last thing is the international law is being seen as a weapon. This is applied to enemies to shield, shielding friends and attacking enemy. It won't work.
Thank you, Dr. Irfan Raja. And now let me bring in Professor Herrera. Professor Herrera, the U.S. Secretary of State calls Iran's threats to the Strait of Hormuz unacceptable, while the U.S. Navy enforces a de facto blockade on Iranian ports, preventing food, medicine, and fuel from entering a sovereign nation. Now, under Article 33 of the UN Charter and the provisions of the Geneva Conventions, is this not a textbook case of collective punishment? If the International Criminal Court can issue arrest warrants for one blockade, why not the other? And are we witnessing a moment where might has fully replaced law? In other words, might makes right. And what does that mean for the entire edifice of post-1945 international humanitarian norms?
Well, when it comes to the relevance of international law, everything is very sensitive, especially if we look from a very political perspective. So I would say that the deeper issue is about consistency, because it is true that many countries in the global south are increasingly perceiving this kind of selective enforcement of international law. So there are some violations which are prosecuted in an aggressive way, while others are treated as necessities, like strategic necessities, and whether or not we may agree or not with that perception, it is politically very sensitive and powerful, and is also reshaping trust in the post-1945 international order, but I would say in a very, very bad negative way, because of course we cannot say that international law is not relevant or it may not matter, because we are clearly witnessing a period in which power is testing the universality and incredibility of humanitarian norms, but I will also say the credibility and the importance of legitimacy processes. So the problem is not simply whether one blockade is legal and another illegal. It may look like this is the problem, but I believe the real problem is the growing perception that international law is becoming asymmetrical. So it may be strict for adversaries, flexible for allies, and it can be violated, because this is what we see. And it's very clear that is happening. There are clear violations of international law. And there is just an attempt to justify or to find a clarification for this. So this perception, whether it is justified or not, in the end weakens institutional legitimacy, and this is happening at the global level. So international humanitarian law particularly depends not only on legal doctrine, but on its constant and consistent application. So once major powers appear exempt for scrutiny, the normative authority of the system begins to erode. And this is the real problem, and this cannot happen and cannot exist. So especially if we use the words like collective punishment, I'm not able to make an evaluation from a legal point of view, because I'm not a lawyer. I'm an international relations scholar, and I'm considering the relevance of international law, and especially international humanitarian law, from the political point of view, and especially from the point of view of political opportunity, and in particularly from the point of view of legitimization, which is most important. And then I would say that the key word for understanding why a blockade is justified or punished and the other is not is exactly consistency and asymmetry.
Now, let's have a look at the economic impact with Mr. Mark William Lowe. Mr. Mark, we are seeing a lot happening, and if we come to look at the latest reports, we see, for example, the United States sanctioning Chinese entities for trading with Iran while simultaneously seizing Chinese-owned tankers. Meanwhile, Europe faces its second devastating energy shock in 4 years. The former Pentagon advisor and harsh critique of this war, Mr. Douglas MacGregor, has said bluntly that the U.S. is fighting a war for Israel, paid for by American consumers and European industry. As a risk analyst who advises cooperations, do you see any scenario where this war serves the long-term economic and strategic interest of the United States whatsoever, and its European allies for that matter? Or is this a catastrophic diversion of the treasure and blood to serve a foreign agenda?
Well, Karim, first and foremost, very well said, Mr. Douglas MacGregor, who boiled the concept down quite perfectly. But moving on, now, Washington might achieve some military objectives, but it's certainly not going to achieve any strategic objectives, which is quite easy to explain. I mean, basically, while the United States is demonstrating various forms of military power, but it's not, and I repeat, it is not demonstrating any form of political or strategic power, simply because, as regards Iran, the current administration never had any form of strategy to begin with, or at least none that actually made any sense to an adult, to a grown-up individual. Now, it's also, going back to MacGregor's comments, it's also very, very important to understand that the United States of America entered a war with Israel against Iran for a very simple reason. Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu managed, very, very ably, without any great difficulty to persuade Trump that it was in the United States of America's interests and that it would be fast, decisive, and importantly, would make him, Trump, look good. So, in similar scenarios, it's horrific. It's actually quite incredible what you can achieve if you know how to stroke a susceptible individual's ego. And unfortunately, the susceptible individual in question is the President of the United States of America. Anyway, amongst many other considerations, moving to the other side, as it were, amongst other considerations, Iran is demonstrating considerable determination, very, very importantly, strategic patience, and Iran has also shown that almost the entire Western economic system can be destabilized by relatively limited disruption in the right place at the right moment. Mm-hmm. And in this specific case, using the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point. So are we really getting anywhere? No. Europe is paying the price once again. Higher energy costs, higher insurance costs, weaker industrial competitiveness. Prices rise. Your industry is no longer as competitive as it was beforehand. The list goes on. Investors in uncertainty, pressure on manufacturing, logistics, etc. So it is a very, very uncomfortable reality. And basically, European governments have little or no control.
Yes, and Mr. Lowe, since you mentioned the costs here, we could actually share some figures. We've seen, for example, Brent crude spike to $126 before the settling, before settling under $100, but the damage is done already. And if we look at Maersk's CEO, he says the conflict adds $500 million in extra costs per month to his company alone. War insurance premiums have jumped from 0.25% of whole value to as high as 8%. The CEO of Ryanair warns that some European airlines will simply collapse. So in pure balance sheet terms, is this war shaping up to be a multi-trillion-dollar mistake that benefits only perhaps oil speculators and American defense giants? Or what signal does it send to global capital about the reliability of the U.S. as a steward of the world's most critical energy choke point?
Right. The real issue isn't the oil price spike in itself. Markets can survive temporary spikes. The real issue, from my point of view, is that the world is now being forced to permanently reprice and reappraise geopolitical risk. Shipping companies, the maritime companies are repricing their routes. Airlines are reconfiguring their fuel assumptions and repricing the part of the budget that goes to acquiring fuels. Insurance, you mentioned, insurers are repricing war exposure. The costs are increasing all of the time. So basically, we have a very, very dynamic situation indeed, and it is it's a domino effect, basically. It's a series of consequences that begin from a single situation that has spiraled out of control. And once the situation starts to spiral out of control, as it already has done, the consequences can be felt very, very, very far away from the actual epicenter itself. So basically, we have a geopolitical crisis that's growing into a structural economic crisis, or rather, a series of structural economic crises. So, why is this particularly dangerous? It's because these effects spread quite silently. Consumers, ultimately are always going to be hit. So the consumer won't see a warship. The consumer is not going to see a missile strike, but they will see higher prices. They will see weaker growth. GDP will slow down throughout not just the Western world, but the entire world. There will be greater inflation, ever greater economic uncertainty, which, as we're very, very well aware, often leads to social and therefore political instability. Mm-hmm. So just to conclude here, the bottom line is that the current US administration, unfortunately, has demonstrated nothing other than incompetency and arrogance. And that this incompetency and arrogance produces long-term global consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Now let me bring back Dr. Hamoud Salhi. An analysis by responsible statecraft used multiple AI models to identify the 5 think tanks most responsible for driving America into this war, Professor. The FDD, AEI, Hudson Institute, WINAP, and the Heritage Foundation all are described as having either a primary mission to support the Zionist entity or a neoconservative ideology that places the entity at the center of their worldview. So as an academic within the American system, Professor Hamoud Salhi, how does this machinery of influence actually work? And is it accurate to conclude, as some harsh critiques do, that U.S.-Iran policy is not made in Washington at all, but it is effectively outsourced to a foreign government's strategic priorities?
I think we have to be clear on the last question. When we say outsourced to foreign entities, we have to name it what it is. Outsourced perhaps to Israel and Israel national agendas that are consistent and supported by Israeli lobby in the US and neoconservative movement. On the think tank issue, we have to understand, number one, the context. These are institutions that are funded either through federal grants, for example, like the Institute of Peace that is designed or that is established by an act of Congress, and there are others. There are so by money funds. The Heritage Foundation, for example, is known these days for crafting Project 25, which has designed American foreign policy, domestic policy, the way we see it today, and we see the changes that are happening. Steve Miller is one of those policymakers who are currently served on the White House cabinets. So there is the funding, and then the placement of people who work in think tanks. And funding also comes from private associations, those who advocate for certain issues. Connected to that is that the institute or the think tanks provide studies and policy, and they are sort of for a fee. And this fee is not small, it's a big one. And then finally, you have experts, and these experts who appear on national media, and they are ready, willing, and there to propagate a policy that is linked to the policy agendas that the think tanks believes in. The trend recently has been shifted, and for years now, to neoconservative. Part of it because of the funding. There is funding, plenty of funding coming from the neoconservative big businesses, billionaires, and so on and so forth. And not only on television and social, it's also on the radio. 90% of the radio ownerships are owned by neoconservative. Consider that Americans spend a great deal of time in the car. In Los Angeles, it is not normal not to spend at least 2 hours a day in the car driving from home to work and so on and so forth. So you have this impact, this context that we have to consider. And usually the way it works is that at the think tanks, they start by formulating scenarios, and you could see this on the website. You could also see it when a conflict erupts by bringing different perspective, or so-called different perspective, but serving one line. Then when that creates debates, and that debates later on formulate into policies, and then it's an appearance on the media. When you look at what is the media presenting these days, is that experts that are connected to defense and connected to conservatives station. In that, and there where the narrative is framed, there are talking points that you need to repeat. For example, in the case of Iran, we are constantly reminded of this threat that Iran has been a threat to the United States for 47 years. But nobody questioned it. We have also constantly repeated the idea that Iran has nuclear weapons, and we play with that a lot, but it's never repeated. But talking points are essential because they create the perception that there is a threat. And if you repeat it multiple times, we reach to what is known as the 1% doctrine, which is the idea is to create conditions or believe that they might have it. They might be a threat, and therefore, since they are a threat, we should err on protecting the United States and see it as a threat. So Iran is a threat because, number one, we don't know the alternative, and second, because we seem to conclude that we are convinced. And finally, there is a huge emphasis on risk. So when the narrative is presented on national television, we constantly are faced with analysis that emphasize the damage, the risk, and emphasize on the other side. And that creates a perception that the United States is a threat and that these policy experts know better. And the public tend to go with them. All of this, sadly, or as we've seen these days, has not been successful, particularly when it comes to the Palestinian issue, which we have now. Vast majority of American public supports that, and for that matter, in other places. But the issue: why do they persist to appear despite a lack of a lack of support? Why do we continue to do the same thing these days, even though Americans don't want the war? The idea is very clear. If you repeat it multiple times, If you say it multiple times, if you follow a narrative, you create the 1% doctrine, which makes American think which way is best to protect. It's better to be to err on the yeah.
Clear. Thank you so much, Professor Hamoud Salhi. Now, let me bring in Dr. Raja. Dr. Raja, of course, if we come to focus again on the human rights file, we see, for example, the Iranian Red Crescent Society submitting 35 dossiers to the International Criminal Court, documenting what it calls systematic war crimes, the destruction of over 132,000 civilian structures, attacks on hospitals, and the blockade-induced suffering of millions. Luis Moreno Ocampo, the ICC's founding prosecutor, has stated that senior U.S. officials could face indictments similar to those from other recent wars, such as the genocidal war in Gaza. Yet major Western human rights organizations have been remarkably muted. As someone who covers the human dimension, is this selective outrage evidence of a dual-tiered system of victimhood, where some civilians actually are worthy of global sympathy and others fall beneath the radar, perhaps, of a politicized human rights industry? How do you see it?
Well, thank you once again, and I agree with exactly. This is the case, and this is the case because we have piles of evidence. A long time ago, the leading two American philosophers, critics, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky, they wrote a book on it. Particularly explaining the concept of worthy and unworthy victims. So their book was like manufacturing consent. How media, in what way they are biased, and all this skillfully designed propaganda through which they mention, people who are, victims, worthy victims and unworthy victims. I'll give you a quick example. Back in 2015, on November 13 and November 14. So any one of your audience and viewers, listeners can confirm it. There was the New York Post have a front page, the headlines. And what happened was on that day, there was a Beirut bombings, one day before the Paris bombings. But when it happened in Beirut, Lebanon, nobody was interested, as it is there was no human there. I'm sorry to say this, but and the next day there were the similar attacks happened in bombings in Paris, and the whole Western media and elsewhere as well. There was piles of news, front pages, headlines. And 24 hours like this television, people are coming, television shows. So and that is very well documented. Still today, you see in Gaza, we are here, and I'm apologize to say this because we are discussing Iran here. But where is Gaza? Gaza is a slow news, as there's nothing happening there. We all know what is happening there, what is happening in Lebanon, and there are some of the conflicts. If you look into Sudan, look into Myanmar, where people are still in concentration camps, in camps, but they are not worthy of the news. So we have this very well documented and very well explained concepts of worthy victims. So and you see it is happening every day when the victims are when they are, for example, Western, when they are, for example, anything happened to one Jewish person, we are not here to sides or every human is same, But the whole point is, for argument's sake, something happened to anyone Western person or in Israel, that is very important for the media. So this is how media says, and everyone knows the idea of chosen people, and everybody knows about the Jewish rabbis who famously said that one Jew is better than 1,000 other people in spiritually or whatever, and that has been this concept have been challenged by the Jewish professors. by the Jewish critics. So coming back to this, you're very right in saying the media is biased. And I wouldn't say the whole media. I would always say, I myself a journalist, I was always say, and I'm always saying this, that media is like polemic. We have most sections of the media, they are deliberately biased. And it's very sad to say, while in your, this discussion panel, like, there's no improvement, very little signs of improvement in the media. Their approach towards, explaining others, the way American media talks about Arabs. There's lots of movies and Hollywood, the way they talk about Arabs like camels and desert, and this is all rooted in Orientalism. Us, very good, smart, intelligent, modern, and them, people elsewhere in global South or in the Middle East, they are not worthy at all, whatever happens. So that is the main concept here, and that is one of the things. What is happening in Tehran is not a news. How many people died? They are attacking, schools, and how many universities have been demolished, deliberately bombed. Now, if you ask this question to ordinary people, they might not know, because the media is not interested in this. The media is only interested that, look, what is happening. So in brief, yes, there is piles of evidence. There are ideal victims, and that is why, they are being, it's a political propaganda.
Clear. Thank you, Dr. Irfan Raja. Now, let me bring back Professor Herrera. Professor Herrera, EU Commission President von der Leyen has warned economic fallout may echo for months or even years to come. Yet the most striking political fallout has been inside the Atlantic Alliance itself. The Parliament of Italy is debating a stop the war resolution. Germany, on the other hand, and France denied overflight rights for U.S. planes targeting Iran. Politico suggests the fragile center of European politics may not survive the cascading cost of living crisis. Is the U.S. managing the extraordinary fate of accelerating European strategic autonomy more than any EU white paper ever could? And with NATO alliance so deeply split, can it still function as a credible security guarantor? How do you see it?
Well, thank you for the question, which is also including several subtopics, I would say. I believe that what we are witnessing is not exactly the collapse of the Atlantic Alliance, but rather a growing divergence in the strategic priorities between the US and European states. For years, European strategic autonomy has been largely a conceptual debate, which was confined to policy papers in Brussels and Paris mainly. But also major shocks like energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, now escalation in the Middle East, have pushed this concept into more a political necessity for many European governments, and yet very difficult to be realized. So the key issue is that European states increasingly fear secondary consequences like energy disruption, inflation, migration pressures, domestic polarization, and also what is most striking for Europe is political radicalization inside Europe itself. And those concerns obviously are not the same that Washington's threat perceptions or timelines. So this divergence is quite clear. This does not mean that NATO is becoming a secondary actor, so NATO remains military indispensable for Europe, and especially regarding deterrence, intelligence, logistics, but I will also say for nuclear guarantees, because alliance do not weaken only through military decline, but also through strategic fragmentation. So the real question for me is not whether NATO can maintain political cohesion when member states disagree not on tactics, but on on the hierarchy of threats and acceptable cost of escalation. So paradoxically, I would say that external crises may be accelerating European strategic thinking more effectively than decades of debates that have been mainly placed at institutional level. First, for the credibility, I would say that credibility has two dimensions. So there's a military capability and political unity. So as for the first one, it's clear that NATO still owns overwhelming military capacity. The concern are more based on the political unity, and because the concern emerging in Europe is about political coherence and decision making under crisis conditions. But at the same time, having a strategic autonomy for the EU does not necessarily mean that the EU turns into an anti-American entities. For many Europeans, being autonomous means reducing the vulnerability to decisions taken elsewhere, whose economic and political costs are ultimately paid inside Europe. And so this is what I think about this very difficult concept, which is credibility for NATO and strategic autonomy for the EU, that I would read by using completely different lenses than those ones that have been used so far by policymakers and scholars.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now let me bring Mr. Marklow to perhaps wider the lens or focus it, let's say, on the economic issue, Mr. Marklow. How are we going to see, for example, Europe managing this crisis? Is there any future order that will define the economic scene in Europe amid this crisis, Mr. Marklow?
I think we have to be very, very honest here and say that Europe doesn't have any particularly clear ideas at the moment as to what the medium term and what the long-term consequences are going to be, and therefore, at the moment, has no clear ideas as to what mitigation and management strategies actually should be put in place. This, of course, in the context of Europe, which is at the best of times, so something more of a condominium than an actual union. So basically what I want to say is, in the context of a very, very fragmented union of 27 plus countries, so very, very difficult to get everybody together and to formulate any singular form of actions or remedial measures, protective measures, etc. So I think right just now, and here I'll conclude, the situation is quite easy to explain. It's that we fully realize that the immediate, the medium, and the long-term consequences of this, if I may say, very ill-advised military conflict in the Middle East. It's a military conflict. It's not a political conflict, because there is basically no strategy that anybody outside of the Oval Office can actually see or detect. So it's not a strategy at all. It remains a conflict. So going back and closing, we know that there are numerous problems. We simply don't know exactly how bad they will be, and we certainly don't know how to go about addressing, how to go about putting together measures to contrast these problems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Marklow. Now, let's have a final round of closing statements, since we are nearing the end of this special coverage. So, Dr. Raja, if we come to speak about the information war, and you being a media professional, we hear, for example, a lot about Iranian disinformation, but the Western information space has been itself flooded with dehumanizing language and predictions of swift victory that never materialized, actually. 71 days later, we see the specter of another unwinnable multi-year quagmire looming. As a professional who actually covered a lot of issues in areas that know the cost of forever wars, how do you assess the propaganda or battle, and what responsibility do Western media and political elites bear for selling a war that we now learn had no realistic endgame beyond regime change?
Thank you. This is the very significant question. And I had covered Afghan war as well, the first one. I must say, first of all, starting with the responsibility of Western media, again, there is campaigning journalism. It is happening. Unfortunately, it is not happening that it should be happening. And there is a evidence, for decades, the Western politicians, they are partying with the sections of the media and they are selling wars. And every war they sell, they're so skillful in designing this propaganda. And the language is basic tool, words and phrases plays important part in this, convincing their own public and broader public elsewhere that they are doing a duty. For example, the Afghan war was sold as like Operation Enduring Freedom. Now, what sort of freedom was there? Then they were telling the people all, we are going there to liberate the women. Many people know, and many did not know, that the Afghans were ahead of Europeans. I repeat it, in a sense that Amanullah Khan, the Queen Suraya, she, during 1990s, 1919 and onward, the Afghan women have the right to vote. At that time, anybody can research. The European women did not have a right to vote. So this is tricky and sometimes funny the way they use words and phrases to convince people. And then once again, the Americans have just started using a phrase, Operation Project Freedom. What sort of freedom it is? So very briefly, the Western, the mainstream media is unfortunately not doing its job. And there was last thing, if you allow me to finish this, C.P. Scott, the famous editor of Guardian, he was talking to a politician, and then, he said, he was talking to a prime minister, and he said that if people know the truth, the war would end tomorrow. And of course, people will never, ever know the truth. That's the reason.
Thank you, Professor Raja. We have unfortunately run out of time. So very quickly, Professor Herrera, if you come to look at the Pakistani mediation, would you think this is a credible off-ramp or a collapse of diplomacy? I mean, because of the hurdles that we're seeing.
Well, it's a difficult question to end the discussion, and also to be quite fast in the answer. Just let me say that the central problem for me is not that non-proliferation regime depend on enforcement capacity, but on legitimacy and reciprocity, because from the perspective of many states in the global south, there's the perception, the growing perception is as everything is asymmetrical. So some states are subjective to intense scrutiny and sanctions, and others are outside formal treaty structures, so they maintain the strategic ambiguity. From a political point of view, the international system is actually very, very, very asymmetrical. So these agreements may succeed, especially if all sides believe that restraints can improve their security more than the escalation. And then this is a lot of to do with political consideration in the end. So I would not say that negotiated peace can collapse, but that there is a need, and I know that these words are not very popular nowadays, a multilateral diplomacy, confidence and trust. And obviously all these things are under severe strain. But these are the only potential way to ground a consensus. If we are not, let's say, believe too much in trust and peace, at least this framework should be based on the consensus that there is more convenience in cooperation rather than in the escalation. Not for peace, probably, if states don't like peace, but for more convenience. And then at the basis of everything, there is asymmetrical relations. So the point is how to wisely manage such asymmetrical relations.
Thank you indeed, Professor Herrera. Now, very briefly, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, I know it is difficult, but unfortunately we ran out of time. I would like to end up with this provocative thought from the analysis of Chas Freeman, the former U.S. ambassador. He argues that the war has already exposed the bankruptcy of the unipolar moment, and that the U.S. will emerge from this diminished regardless of the tactical battlefield outcome. Would you agree with this?
I don't think the United States will emerge as a winner. Technically and realistically, we are on the verge of a new world order, and we are all waiting for this. What's happened? The crisis, the genocide in Gaza, the war in the Ukraine, and now Iran have set stages for a different world order. And as the Professor Herrera said, there are structures that need to be looked at and re-examined. The role of institution would not be supporting the United States. The United States, what has this episode proved that the United States has the capability, has the tremendous power to bomb people, but it has not. It has not the capacity to change the facts on the ground or the policies in general. So the unipolar system, from this perspective for the future, I think United States will not sort of succeed. I think we are shifting to different areas. And I think one last point, what Algeria did in the United Nations Security Council needs to be reminded. The Algerians went with the idea that there are institutions that we cannot change today, but let's form a historical precedent so that we can make it later. Those historical facts, by putting countries that were against Palestine put on record their vote, will create seeds for how the new world order will be shaped. So.
Thank you, Professor Hamoud Salhi, for all these insights. We have to leave it there, and fortunately, my profound thanks to all our guests, Dr. Hamoud Salhi, Professor Herrera, also Mr. William Marklow, and Dr. Ifan Raja. Thank you all for your insights and precious time. So at the beginning of 72 days, a cautious ceasefire and 12 hard questions, a troubling picture emerges. We see a military campaign that was sold as swift surgical strike defending freedom, but has in reality exposed the deep hypocrisies at the heart of the rules-based order, a blockade deemed illegal for one side but justified for the other, human suffering that merits ICC investigations unless the accused are protected by a veto, an energy shock that punishes European allies and American working families, while the core strategic beneficiary appears to be a single foreign state. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning into our channel, and until our next coverage, we'll see each other again. Take care.